I'm located in Europe, in Sweden, and with me today I have Rohit.
Hello everyone, I'm Rohit Gulati. I'm a program manager as well. I'm based out of London.
My area within the identity group is around external identities, which is B2C, B2B, and the new and upcoming technology around decentralized identities. And of course, I mean, being in identity, you use graph more or less all the time. So that's what we have here for you today. Let's get going. And this is the agenda for today. We'll start with an overview of Microsoft Graph, what it is, also an overview of Graph Explorer, so you get familiar with that one. Then we'll get into the topics about access and permission, how to interact with it. Then look into the REST API to do the CRUD operations, how to do the querying, etc. At the end, we'll look into the metadata, how you can navigate in the graph here. And I'll show you at the end what you can do with automation and DevOps, how you can make use of graph in those areas. But first, what is Microsoft Graph? Microsoft Graph, it is a gateway to data and nowadays also intelligence around Microsoft 365, our cloud service. It's a unified programming model with a single endpoint, Graph Microsoft Com. We've had a bit of confusion with the Azure AD Graph, that is Graph Windows Net. But I think that as time has moved on, people know that it's Graph Microsoft Com that we should use, and we are on feature level to start using Graph. So if you by accident are using Graph Windows Net, you should be aware that you should really start move on to Graph Microsoft Com to make sure that that is what you're using. We also have connectors and Data Connect, kind of a similar name, but it works like with the connectors, you can extend and get your data or other data into the graph, so it can be used via the programming endpoint. And with data connectors, you can do the opposite. You can take data that is in the graph and connect it to other consumers like Azure Event Hub, etc. So you can use the data that is in the graph. Then the question is, what is the graph then? Well, you do have the core services like bookings, calendar, program data like Excel, OneDrive, etc., Search, OneNote, Outlook, where you can, I mean, in the old world with Win32 APIs, etc., and the Office APIs, you could manage the data that way and access it. But in the cloud world, you can use Graph to query data like what's in OneDrive, what's in that folder, do I have any messages lately in my Outlook inbox, where is the OneNote, etc. So you can easily use that and query that data that exists with in Office 365 in the cloud. You also have the EMS services, the Enterprise Management Suite, as it was called, where you have Azure AD, and this Azure AD is really one of the core things in the graph with its user, directory objects, groups, etc., that you can use to add data that you then can sort of assign permissions, etc. to. You also have the advanced threat analytics and the threat protection, where you can get access to that type of data via the graph. It's also about Identity Manager and Intune. Intune really should have the new name, but it's still called Intune here in this slide, where you can query that under the umbrella of the EMS services. You also get access to the Windows 10, the device services like device notifications and universal print. Dynamics 365 is also available via the graph, where you can query Business Central data out of the graph. One thing to address here, what is not, you probably know of the Azure Resource Manager and the way to access and provision things in Azure like web apps, virtual machines, storage account, Kubernetes clusters, etc. That's not Graph. It has its own management API, management.azure.com. It's a little bit intertwined because we're using the same authentication system with Azure AD, so you still need to get the access tokens, etc., to do the things that you want to do. But once you've got the token, if it's Azure Resource Manager, you fire off the calls to management.azure.com, and if it's the graph, it goes to graph.microsoft.com. The PowerShell libraries and Azure CLI hides this a bit, because if you have a commandlet and a command where you can do things, the PowerShell commandlets cover both. You can do things on a virtual machine, a web app, and you can manipulate entities that really exist in the graph. But technically, you have two endpoints, and one is graph and the other is the Azure Resource Manager. Then we have the Graph Explorer, and that is, you can think of it like it's our postman tool on top of Graph, where you can start to get familiar, easily query it, etc., and play with queries and test them, etc., and see how it works. It's an online tool that is very helpful to get started, to do ad hoc queries, etc., and see how it works, see if you get the right data. Regardless if you're doing scripting or if you're programming, etc., it's an easy tool to get started with. Remember that it's just an application like any other that is using the Graph API. It could be something that you have written or someone else has written. So in order to give permissions to start accessing this, you need to add the permissions to the app, because otherwise, I mean, Graph Explorer has 0 permissions to begin with. And once you start using it, and you add the permissions that you want it to have. It's the same as if you sort of purchase an other application from a third party, etc. Do you want it to have the permission to reset passwords, delete user objects, etc.? It's something you need to consider and grant that application permissions. And it's the same with Microsoft Graph Explorer. You will see that when you play with it, that it will ask for permissions every now and then, or very often, to be honest, but that's because you haven't granted it yet. So you need to sort of make sure that you give it the permissions to complete the queries. It's also got some other golden nuggets hidden here, and that's the sample queries that you have in the lower left corner, where you can sort of look at how do I do this, how do I do that, etc., and start to get a feeling for how to use it if you're unsure, if you sort of just not done that before, that area of type of querying. It also got other things like you can sort of what you're doing, you can get code snippets. It's adaptive. So if you're querying a user object, it will show you how you could take that as a code snippet, import it into C#, JavaScript, or Java, etc. The toolkit component is even something that it helps you as a web developer, because if you want to have that look and feel, having sort of that little rectangle about a user and showing its presence with a small picture, etc., the toolkit component can help you to add that, and it's framework agnostic, meaning that it's HTML. If you add it, it will work together with the graph data, as long as you can access it and get it. So with that, let's jump to Graph and show this. Just going to do this. I'm going to enter the Graph Explorer. When it loads, if you don't know the URL, just search for Microsoft Graph Explorer, and it will be one of the top links that you'll get. It loads like this, which means that it looks like it's ready to go, etc. But in the sign in button in upper left, you see that currently it's just using sample data. In order to get going, you need to sign in. And this is, you need to know the tenant you're going to be signing into, and you can't do switch directories, etc. like that, because you're signing into a common endpoint. This is just an OAuth application doing OpenID Connect auth code flow using the common endpoint. So if you're using your corporate credential and trying to sign into a tenant, it's going to default to that tenant. So therefore, sometimes when you, let's see, I need to do the right account here. If you want to sign into an account or a tenant, you need to make sure you have an account in that tenant, especially for B2C. So let's sign into my test tenant here, like this. Yes, yes. And as you can see, now I'm signed in. I can do stuff like query myself, get some data. You see that we have two endpoints. We have the version 1 and we have beta endpoint. It's two APIs in the backend, two graph APIs, where we put stuff in the beta endpoint for stuff that is coming, and you can use that. You just need to use a different endpoint. And the V1 is sort of, that is sealed, it's delivered, it's going to stay there, be there forever until we have 1.1. You'll also notice that the V1 endpoint has far less data. It just gives you some defaults. The rest is there, you need to ask for it. While most of the services, if I switch to the beta endpoint, it basically spews out the entire entity with all the attributes, etc., for you to see. So sometimes it's easier to work with the beta endpoint because it gives you all the details. But remember, if you're sort of scripting something or writing something for production, make sure you sort of use the V1 endpoint if it's going to be in production or something like that. So yeah, with the getting started, you can just click on it and it will load like my profile, my photo, where is Basil faulty, etc. My manager, I don't think he has one, and you could do my mail and it will show you the mail if you do have a mail enabled account. The code snippets that I talked about, if I flip to code snippets here, you can see that it's adapted to the type of query that I'm using. It's actually showing graph client, me, photo, content, etc., so that you can get that. The tool, let's see, it's better if I do that one. Toolkit component like this. It will show you this so that you can add templates like this into your HTML pages and get the same experience, etc., depending on what object it is. The way you query data here also is, I mean, you need to know that it's like this. You can query me, that's a shortcut. You can do it by ID. I have to grab this user's ID like this. And I'm not going to use this one. I can query it directly with like this, and I will get the same result. I can go further if I just want the display name. I can put that one in the path like this to make the path longer. And if you see in the photo, if you like data like a photo, which is really an image, JPEG or something, you see it goes further. The path is me, photo, and it has $value, which means that I really don't care about the JSON stuff that describes this. I just want the picture because I need to display it somewhere. If I remove the value, you can see that I get the JSON structure instead of this. So you can go all the way to say, I just want the value for this. So that was that. And if you see the access token here, you can see that and permissions, you can see what permissions you have. If a query fails, you will see that it will not say 200, it will give you a reason why it fails. It probably means you need to scoot over to the modify permissions, etc. Look into what it wants you to do to consent and press that. You can also see that you can see your current access token to see what type of permissions you have, etc. So you might sort of want to look into that. We will do that a little bit later. And I think that later is now. But first, let's describe this. Access and permissions. Remember that the Graph API is just an API like any other REST API that is protected by Azure AD. So it needs a JOT token from Azure AD for authorization to continue. So that means that any application we write or scripting language that we use, etc., like Graph Explorer, needs to get authenticated and ask for permission to use the Graph API. Then comes the question, I mean, you don't get a wildcard ticket. You need to ask for the scopes and permissions and make sure that you have those to query the right data. If you want to read the email messages, you need to have the permissions to read the email messages, etc. You just can't sort of expect Graph to fix it. It's just a REST API that needs a JOT token like the rest. So how does that work? Well, you can start looking into that with snooping in the access token that you have in Graph Explorer. If I look at mine, it's a lot of gobbledygook here, and I can copy it, and I can take it over to jot.ms, which is a JOT tool to decrypt an access token or ID token, and you will see that it has a lot of details. Perhaps I should make this a little larger. A lot of details that's not really interesting here, We can see that it was issued for Graph Explorer something, me as a user. Then we can see in scopes that I've clicked on the permission quite a lot, because you see I've got a lot of scopes here: application read all, application read write all, calendar read write, etc. So I would probably be able to run quite a lot of queries in Graph Explorer before I do something that I'm not authorized to do. But let's see if I can create such a scenario anyway, just to show you. Me has a way that I can say me send mail, meaning I can actually send a mail via Graph Explorer if I like to. So here I have, I need to add a request body, and I need to switch to post. We'll come to that later in order to try to use this operation. And here I'm actually trying to send an email via sending a JSON payload to the graph. And when I do that, it says, nope, 403 forbidden. You haven't consented for this permission. You can't send emails. And if I flip over, you see that I haven't mail sent in my list. I can't do that. So if I really wanted to do this, I would need to press consent. And me as an admin, I needed to have the right to press consent here. But I'm not going to send email messages. That makes no sense in Graph Explorer. If you ever are in using Graph Explorer to test and you're doing post, put, delete, etc., where you manipulate entities, make sure you flip back to get so you accidentally don't overwrite or delete something just by pressing run query or hit enter in the wrong place. So all these permissions, where do they come from? Well, you can actually look that up yourself, because it's not that complicated that you might think of. See, like this, because this is a REST API where we access any REST API. It's just called Graph. So, and we have given the Graph Explorer, our app, permission to do this. So it must be stored somewhere in the permission system. And if we locate Graph Explorer with Graph, we can actually look it up and say, hey, we should have a service principal called Graph Explorer. Do we? Yep, we do. So let's do that first part. I'll run the query to see if I do have a service principal named Graph Explorer. And sure enough, it's just a registered application like anyone else with the name of Graph Explorer official site and a lot of reply URLs to all the different versions that we have, etc. The second step is in order to sort of understand where these permissions come from, is to look at the OAuth permission grants. And what I'm going to do then is to take the app ID from Graph Explorer. I'm going to use my own user ID, and I'll tell you why in a second. Because doing that will give me this data to look at the permissions, where basically we do have data in Graph saying that here's the Graph Explorer. Here's me as a user executing Graph Explorer currently. And here I have a resource which happened to be the Graph API object ID in itself, i.e. the resource that we're using. And here are the scopes. Here are your scopes that have been granted. Here's your permissions. You've got to get these in the access token when you're asking Graph for an access token for this resource. So I can actually show you this in the Graph Explorer like this. Asking now, show the OAuth permission grants for this app and this user, and you see that it's a long list. As I said, all the things that I had in the access token, here they are, which means that every time I'm asked, like the mail send, etc., to modify the permission, this entity in Azure AD gets updated. And next time I'm asking for an access token, it pulls the scope out and puts it in the access token, and I get more permissions and can do more complex queries, etc. So the CRUD operations. Yeah, query, we've done quite a lot of that. That's the easy part. You need to find the resource that you actually want to query. You can find the direct ID, etc. Do that in a different ways, navigate to an attribute within that entity, or could even be a navigational property and then you can sort of navigate all the way to the value. When you do post, you craft a JSON payload of what you want to create, but the post is you need to create a new entity. So if the unique ID or anything else that needs to be unique, like a user principal name or something like that, if that already exists, it's going to give you an error to say, no, you can't do this. It cannot do it. But if it works, you get a 201 back saying, I've created this object, and it echoes back the complete object for you. And then we have patch, which is if you want to just update something, one attribute, etc., you craft a payload in such a way that only the attributes that you want to update, you send it, you invoke the patch method, and you patch the existing object. You get a 204 no content back. Put is a little bit of a mix here because it completely overwrites an existing data. It doesn't really care what was there before. Whatever you send as the payload, if it contains the minimum set of attributes that is needed, it's just going to overwrite, and whatever was there before is gone. Not all entities allow this. You can't do put on a user, for instance, but you can do it on other things. Delete is pretty simple. If you have the path to the object and you fire it away with delete, it is going to delete it, and you get a 204 back, no content. My user here. Let's go back to myself to show you this. You see this is my user, Basil Fawlty. He has an office location of that for whatever reason, but that is not correct because I believe that the office location is actually Torquay in Cornwall, England. So let's flip to patch and patch Mr. Fawlty here like that. I get a 204 back. And if I revert back to get again and query it, sure enough, I've updated the attribute to Torquay. This is an easy way to do it. You just send it if you have the permissions, user read write all, etc. Or if it's yourself, you can update like this. So querying, that's if you're developing something with REST API, that's where you're going to spend, I would say, 75% of your time trying to figure out how to get this query to work. Why can't I get the data I want, etc. I've shown you the direct query where you target the resource, you find the ID, and you get it. That's pretty fast. If you want to have more attributes that are not shown, or if you want to limit them, like in the beta endpoint where you get everything, use the select like this, and let's flip to beta. So I get everything like this, users, myself, and with the beta endpoint, you see I get a lot of data back, but I don't want that. So it's time to start using the select. And if you ever done anything with like SQL, you'll get this because it's just like SQL. You just specify what attributes you want back, and that's what you get. You limit that. Filter is, compared to SQL, is the where clause, where you specify, well, I'm going to query like the user's object, but I really don't know the unique ID, or I don't care to find it out. I want to do it in a simpler way. I just want to, I know the display name, and that's enough. Please give me the object. So in that case, you would do something like this: select equal attribute name equal quotes. Like this, you could query the object. Ooh, and I've done something wrong for trying to do two things at the same time. Filter, you can do it like this. And if you want to filter something that is not a simple object like display name, if you have an attribute that is actually a collection of things, you need to learn the awkward syntax of filtering on attributes that are a collection. And in this case, other mails is a collection. So you need to sort of have the lambda-like syntax of saying, look into the collection, and if anything matches that, bring it back to me, etc. Give it to me. Then you can, if you have lots of data like users in your organization, it's just querying for all the users. That's really, it will give you a lot of users, but it's going to be a long list. And what are you going to do with it? If you want to sort of scroll through it and present it page by page, or do asynchronous processing that you ask for the next 10, etc., and you do something and you go back, you more or less do the top, skip, etc. You could do top, and you could say skip the first two like this. Oh, I don't need to do that. Sorry, let's do that first, like this. And what it will give you is, it will give you the first 5 or whatever you ask for. Then it will give you an OData link that is called next link with something that we really don't need to understand what it is. But if we submit it, it will give us the next set of data that's in the users collection. So if you're doing something and you're paging through in the user interface, or if you're doing in scripts, etc., using top and the skip token, etc., is quite nice to browse through it like this. Then we have batching, and batching is sending one query to the graph, but the query in itself contains a lot of queries, so you can get it to do multiple things. And you do that via using a post and having the payload contain what you really want it to do. So let's see if I do like this, and you need to hit a special endpoint then that is called batch. And you need to post, because it's going to send data. And what you're doing then is sending a lot of data that are sort of requests that you want to do. You see the first one, you can actually have the ID could be whatever you like it to be, but you need to have it to correlate on the responses. You see the first is get on me, the second is get on my photo, the third is I'm going to list a few email messages that I get. So if I post this, it will be one request to the graph, and when it comes back, it will give me all the details. You can see the first request I had was status 200, and here are the details, etc., and so on. That was the user. I probably will see the photo. Yeah, here's the JPEG, and further down I will have the email message. So the trick here is just to stitch them together and fire it away, and then have the sort of the pain of looking through the response of all the details. What happened? Oh, I got a 200. I got a 404. I got a 403, etc. What do I do in all these scenarios where I get mixed set of response status codes back? But it can be pretty efficient, because let's see if we can have an example here, or I'll increase the font a bit. Let's see if I can. I got some PowerShell here where I'm going to import a set of users, 10 users, not that much, but it'll give you an idea of how you can use this. I'm going to first just run a script that is via graph, creating the users from a CSV file, putting them in a B2C tenant, and that's it. That's as exciting it is. This is just using Graph API one by one, reading the one line, sending it to Graph API, reading the next, sending it to Graph API, and you see that 10 users took a little less than 5 seconds, which means that I get two users per second, which is not that fast perhaps, and it's going to take a lot of time. And can I do this faster? Yes, you can. And I just need to delete all these users so I can run this again, deleting them. Let's see how fast this runs, because it depends if it's warm-up time or not. I have the same script, but now it's going to run it via batch. I believe we're going to do 5 at a time, etc., and see what happens. Oh, I did 10 at a time. So what happened is I read all the files, I created the JSON payload, I sent it to the graph in a batch operation, and you saw 10 users created, and this time it was sort of 0.5, 0.6 seconds. So if you're in a situation where you need to bulk import data, perhaps batch is going to be faster, and you also can do stuff asynchronous. So while you posted this to graph, you can sort of take care of the previous 10 and output the correct status, what happened with them. Now, metadata, and that is the question, what resources can I query and what's in the graph really? First of all, I mean, if you're looking for the answer to this, you can always go to the documentation. It will tell you what's there, etc., what you can do. how it looks, etc. But you don't need to go there. You can actually ask Graph itself for the metadata. And if you go to the Graph endpoint, you need to specify beta or V1 so it knows which metadata to pull up. You get the information you're looking for. So let's go back to this one. And if I just say Graph, Microsoft.com v1.0 like this, I'm going to get a JSON structure back to say, hey, these are all the resources that you can ask for. Perhaps not that readable, but you can do that in PowerShell, etc., to get the details in a way that looks a bit nicer. So see if I can do that. If I do the same in PowerShell into Graph objects and do Graph, the dollar Graph objects value, you see you get it in a little bit nicer way. This was the beta endpoint that I asked. So you see here's a full list of all the resources that exists and that you can query for, like directory objects, permission grants, etc. So if you're wondering, I wonder if that is available in a Graph, you could look at the metadata and see, yep, it looks like it is. Then the next question is, how do I get there? Because this is just the sort of the entities that are stored or available via the Graph. It might be that it's stored in Outlook or an Exchange or something like that. And to answer that, yeah, you need to look at the metadata. It's the same endpoint, you just add $metadata. This time it's not going to return JSON, it's going to return XML. And it's going to show you things like what entities do I have, what complex type exists, and that is something that is not like display name that has a simple string value where you have complex type. It's going to show you all the enumerations with the values that you can set to that enumeration, to that attribute. It also has some functions and actions, and send mail is one of them. When you look at this and navigate, if we take user as an example, look at the entity type user, it will say that, well, I derive from something called directory object. That makes sense because, I mean, it is a directory object. I picked a few properties here to show you like this. I picked a few properties here, like display name, that's a simple property. It's just a string. Business phone, that's a collection of string. So it's just going to be like with a collection in JSON. Then we come to complex type, which is you have an object within an object, like password profile. It's going to say that the type of this is password profile, and I need to scoot over and have a look at password profile to see what that is. Then you have a collection of complex types, like identities, where it says this is not just a complex type, it is a collection of a complex type. That helps you to sort of navigate how the object looks like. Then you have the navigation properties, and you can think of that as sort of links going from one place to the other. And that really helps you to navigate from entity to entity. Like if a user, do I have a manager? And it looks like you can only have one manager here. And it can be a directory object, meaning that I could have an application or a group as a manager. That would be exciting to see, but it's most probably going to be a user. Member of, it's going to be a collection of directory objects because I could be a member of many things. When you traverse this and navigate like directory object, you will see that that is something and it's based on entity. It's pretty boring entity. And then eventually you will see that you have a type that is the sort of the base type, like entity is, that defines the ID, etc. And the ID is a string. So with that, when you're wondering how can I query these objects, etc., if you don't know, look at the documentation or start using the metadata for understanding what can I do? Is it possible to get conditional access policies out? Yes, there is. Okay, what's the data? How can I sort of add stuff to it? So I want to update it myself. That is what you use with the metadata. And let's flip to this. And if we're lucky, we will get some data like this. So if I look for type name equal user like this. Here we are. Quite a lot of data. Here you see that you have the entity type for the user, etc. And you can see the different attributes that you have on the user. You can see what they're made up of and follow sort of the definition of something all the way to see how it works. So that is that. Let's see on here. Yeah, automation and DevOps. Graph is it's easy to use. It's just REST API. You just need to have the access token and prepare it to have the appropriate access scopes within the access token. And for that, when you do automation, you don't have a real user. You most often create an app registration in the target tenant, and it needs to live within the tenant that you're about to sort of query. And you do that just as a normal app registration and granting the permission that you are going to use. Directory read write all might be tempting, but please be a little bit more sort of granular about what the application is intended for, so you don't have a really powerful app that can do anything with your objects. Then you create a request to get a token using the client ID and the client secret you got from the app registration. You specify scope as graph microsoft.com.default, and you can do something like this in PowerShell, where you just do a client credential specifying the ID, the client secret, the scope, ask for a token, and then you can test it to see that it actually works. Let me see if I can do this more or less the same here. I have the body that I'm sending to get the access token. I'm invoking the endpoint for my tenant to say, hey, token endpoint, can you please give me an access token? And I think the response is something like this. I've asked for an access token and I've got one. And if I have a look at it in jot.ms, you will see that I don't have all that much to access to this. I call my app graph application, and the only thing I can do is basically read all users. That's all I can do, nothing else. If I try to manipulate another object, it would say, no, you cannot. But at least I can manipulate objects. So with that, let's try to see if I can use this little script to list out all the users in this tenant 10 at a time using the top 10, and I could, which means that this is the way to do it if you want a script, depending on what language, etc. But it's quite easy. It's all about creating the REST APIs. I said that I'm a program manager in external identities, so I'll show you a little thing in DevOps using automation and Graph API. Trying to grab this. I have a small repository here in DevOps. It's a B2C custom policy, which lives as a directory object. So I do have 5 policy templates for sign up, password reset, profile edit, etc. In order for them to get activated, I need to upload them into B2C, and I do that via Graph. If you know nothing on B2C, the policies need to contain some data that binds them to the tenant that they're going to be in. So part of this sort of the DevOps thing here is to replace some things that are generic and overwrite that and make it tenant specific, so it will work in the tenant that we try to deploy them to. Otherwise, it will not work. So the deployment part is actually 2 scripts. One is called prepare, the other is called deploy. What they do, they prepare, is getting an access token via Graph API with the appropriate permissions. Is getting some application information out via Graph because it needs to get some object IDs and app IDs to replace these policies so that they are ready to go. That's the prepare part. The deploy part also gets an access token, but what it does then is using the Graph to upload the policy. And if you have very good eyesight, you'll see that uploading a policy is about doing a Graph API put, meaning I completely replace whatever was there with a new policy. So throw that away, and here comes the new one. And of course, in a pipeline like this, I would need to have variables somewhere for these client credentials with the client ID, etc., for it to work. And if I create a new release, let's hope it runs like this. And I deploy it. Yep, go, go, go. In progress. Now let's see wait time we have. But as you saw, part of this is getting an access token from Graph and querying data or getting data, querying data or updating data. Just to prove to you that we're actually doing this live. I do have the B2C tenant here with 0 policies. So when this is done, we should have some policies. And if the demo gods are good today, we will be able to run them. What task tool do you use to replace the config values? Well, this demo is really, really simple. It's just PowerShell to load the file via get content, doing using the XML DOM and replacing the values inside it, and then use set content on the drop that goes to the release. Oh, something is happening. Thank you.
So till it comes up, I think there was some request on the chat on the PowerShell script that you had shown. Is it in your GitHub?
Yep. You have the link there, and it's the exact same. I just added one trace so you can see that. Because it didn't really say that we were doing something with Graph API, but you can see here when I'm doing the release part that I added this trace to say, hey, I'm actually acquiring an access token for Graph API for this tenant. And then it's pushing the policies to B2C, and we're done. And if we scoot over to B2C, we can see that we have the policies called ADO sign up, sign in. And if I cross my fingers, you see that it works. So yeah, this was deployed. This is just one example of using Graph in automation and ADO. It doesn't have to be ADO. You could use Jenkins, you could use your own scripts, etc. But it's quite easy to get the job done if the object is stored in Graph. That was what I had to say here. So let's see if we have a little bit of time for questions. If you want to open mic, or otherwise ask them in the chat and we'll answer them there.
And just scrolling up, I think there was another question on the previous PowerShell script that you had for bulk create of the user.
Ah, okay. Bulk create of the user. That is actually, from time to time, I give a B2C training, and Graph API is one section. It's really small, but it's just because B2C people need to understand Graph. So it's actually 8 modules, and the user migration is one of them. Paul Newman, are there any plans to support throttling with Graph API endpoint for PowerShell outside of the PowerShell SDK? Do you mean to handle it the nice way when you get a 429, please retry with a retry after, etc.?
You got it. So yeah, that's one of the challenges I've got internally is working with large or big data under Graph. I find it increasingly difficult, especially within PowerShell, to try and handle the throttling and the OData next links in an efficient way. You do have an SDK pack for C# that that covers it, but nothing really for PowerShell outside of my creating my own functions, specifically looking for those error codes and trying to handle them in a diligent way.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for you. I'm sorry for the PowerShell module. I will make sure to look into it to see what we're doing, because I mean that it's two different teams. I mean, you have the graph team, the different resource team, and then you have the tooling team that makes the PowerShell module. So I mean, it's a bit of a coordination, and I'm not in the PowerShell team myself, so that's why I need to check it up to see what we're doing in that area.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep.
So I have a question around permissions. So giving, say, user.read.all is a very broader permission. Is there any plan to scope to subset of data so that we can, the user, when we give that permission, user can only read user which belongs to certain groups? Same can be extended to other objects.
Yeah. This is, of course, a question that sort of has many answers because it depends on the resource type, what you're doing, and how you can do that. The Outlook Exchange people probably have their solution for how to do it when it comes to different folders, etc. But I know that in the application area, where within Azure AD, where you sort of who can manage the API permissions for different application registrations, we are looking into how to do what you're asking there to make sure that you cannot sort of change too much, that you only allowed to work with a certain administrative unit. For users, I don't have an answer here. Oh, add scope graph permissions to OU. Oh, okay. Could this be limited to subordinates where manager is a current user ID? Well, exact details, I mean, it probably, when we get there, is probably you decide who gets that role, etc., who can do the permission. So you're in control. Okay.
Thank you very much, Krister and Rohit, and thank you everyone for joining. This is definitely enlightening for me and as everyone else. So we will have this recording available on the YouTube channel we mentioned, and we'll see you next month on August 19th. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.